Wrath introduces something entirely new to Subaru. The way her power constantly resonates back and forth leads to this infinitely growing sense of whatever emotion Sirius wants him to feel. It's this mental torture that's explored more deeply in the novels, along with the whole fight that we didn't get to see. Subaru had actually channeled his inner Indiana Jones and faced off head-to-head with Sirius in a way that was somewhat impressive. Sure, it may have just ended up with him dying anyway, but his whole approach towards it highlighted just how much he'd grown. So, as I go through that and all the other little details, hopefully you enjoy seeing everything the anime left out from the novels. I'll be making these every week for every episode, so feel free to subscribe if you want to know everything there is to know about ReZero. Let's get started. Episode 52, Decisive End of Ice and Fire, covering chapters 1 and 2 from volume 17 of the light novel. With Subaru having returned from death for the first time in a year, you'd be surprised to know the emotion he was feeling now was anger. It wasn't so much this grim despair or uncertain confusion, but instead this endless resentment towards the fact that he had died. You see, it was over a year ago that Subaru vowed never to plunge headfirst into death again, yet only moments ago he walked right into it. His resolve to challenge every hardship and ordeal with every ounce of strength he had was effectively rendered meaningless in the face of who he now knew as Wrath. So, for him to fail the pledge he'd made back during the witch's trial in Sanctuary, well, that overwhelmed him with both shame and anger. It was a brutal combination that would have resulted in self-loathing next, if not for Subaru realizing how little time he had. Before, all his save points were hours to days before the moment of his death, but this time it was only minutes. It was a brand new challenge that Subaru had never faced before. Now, it was during all this that Priscilla couldn't even be bothered, and that actually went to comfort Subaru a bit. The way it was so in character for her just put him at ease. This helped him to compose his thoughts and eventually led to his decision to try things solo. Normally, Subaru would have had no problem asking Beatrice for help, but because Amelia was a likely target, he couldn't risk having her be by herself. Ever since what had happened to Rem, Subaru was constantly fearful of a similar fate befalling Amelia. He was so traumatized by that the fear of what could happen drowned out any thoughts of what should happen. He didn't ever think that way with Beatrice though, since regardless of what danger awaited them, Subaru knew his fate was intertwined with hers now. His sentiments towards her wouldn't ever stop him from fighting with her, since their relationship had crossed that line of resolve long ago. They were truly a team that would face everything together. Fast forward now to the confrontation in the tower, and this is where the biggest portion of content was cut. Not only did Subaru approach the whole thing completely different, but his end was a lot more disturbing than what we saw. So it was as Subaru rushed there that he contemplated what happened in the last loop. He didn't know exactly how it was he died, but what he did know was that Sirius induced some type of mental corruption. He had essentially lost his mind, and that made remembering things a lot more difficult. Since the memories he retained after death were influenced by his state during the moment of death, that made assuming anything from the last loop very risky. That being the case, choosing how to approach this loop was gonna be a lot harder. Like, he could cause a commotion and scatter everyone away from the tower, but that would only end up delaying things. Sirius clearly didn't have a specific target in mind, so if her show didn't happen here, then Subaru knew it would just happen somewhere else. It was a hollow victory that didn't change anything, not the type of win that Subaru would be satisfied with. So, Subaru would be a bit more proactive and scope out the tower, until finding that the door was open. Inside was surprisingly empty, since the magical nature of the clock meant that no mechanical pieces were necessary. It made it so the only things present were the support pillars and a massive staircase. It was a hollow tower in which only his footsteps echoed. Eventually, Subaru had climbed to the point where he could hear Luzbel, but rather than him being by himself, Subaru could also hear the ramblings of the person who captured him. Right there with Luzbel was Sirius telling him just how proud she was of him. The tone sounded very reassuring, but the actual words were more like a blessing and a curse. It made it clear that the person speaking wasn't sane at all. It was from here that Subaru would have to approach quietly, putting to action the silent stepping lessons he was taught by Clind, Subaru's mentor and a steward serving AniRose. He's the one who's been training Subaru, and in addition to teaching him how to walk quietly, He's also the one who taught him how to use his whip, a weapon Subaru was now proficient with, enough to be deemed somewhat decent. It's not like he was an expert, but he did possess a level of mastery that was considered acceptable. The whip itself was a bullwhip just like Indiana Jones's, except Subaru's was a bit longer, making it slightly more difficult to use. It was a custom gift from Clind, serving as a sort of graduation present, one that bore the name of the demon beast it was crafted from. As for why Subaru chose the whip, well, as a weapon well suited for tricks and feints, it fit nicely with Subaru's own style of fighting. He knew he couldn't compete against swordsmen in a sword fight, but perhaps something like a whip could make things a bit more even. So if there was any weapon that could match his cunning, the whip was certainly one of the best candidates. It also gave him the ability to quickly land hits against opponents that were stronger than him. So, as Subaru slowly crept up behind Sirius, he first made sure he was within range to land an attack, then quickly wound his whip in a way that emphasized speed over force. He wasn't so strong that he could knock someone out instantly with it, but if he could at least restrain his target before they noticed, then that on its own was a significant advantage for him. He was hoping to grab hold of Sirius, then toss her over the banister. It was before the whip could even wrap itself around Sirius's neck, though, that Sirius would already be asking Subaru why he was so angry. She hadn't even turned around, yet somehow she knew that Subaru was in the middle of attacking her. That's when she would deflect the whip with her own chains, entangling the two together, making both of them useless. Fortunately, this worked in Subaru's favor, since all he had to do now was tug to force her off balance. It was just enough to make her stumble and give Subaru the opportunity to tackle her, a powerful charge that would send her over the banister anyway. That's when Subaru would finally start to save Luzbel, leading to the events that we saw in the anime. If you're wondering how Sirius was able to find her way back up, well, somehow she'd managed to fling her chain, pull Subaru down, then use the resulting force to propel herself back up. She'd essentially hit Subaru with the Uno reverse card and left him for death by what was essentially a barbed hanging. This wasn't what made this death so grisly though, since in the midst of Sirius revealing her power, Subaru was descending into a form of madness completely different from the first one. With his and Luzbel's fear bouncing back and forth, stacking on top of each other, the cascading effect it had on Subaru's mind made him lose his very sense of self. For him, everything in this moment was now fear. From Sirius's voice to the air itself, absolutely everything, no matter how minute, terrified Subaru down to his very core. Like, he wanted to close his eyes and see no more, but even the dark went to scare him too. It was after that the thought of never seeing light again scared him, then it was this thought process that kept spiraling out of control. It went on and on until fear in its purest form became the only thing that Subaru could comprehend anymore. To him, fear was the only truth now. So, in the end, Subaru didn't know whether he died from hanging or terror-induced cardiac arrest, but what he did know was that he never wanted to feel that way again. The way he lost everything that made him who he was, made him realize that maybe he should ask for help. Luckily, that experience wasn't all for naught, since Subaru now understood a bit of Sirius's resonance ability. He figured it was an authority that let her manipulate people's emotions. He wasn't quite sure how it worked, but the fact it affected him went to show that he wasn't immune to authorities like how he hoped he was. Ever since he was able to resist the authority of Sloth, Subaru hoped his connection to the witches would allow him to resist all the other Archbishop's authorities. Sirius had unfortunately proved this otherwise, but that in itself was valuable information too. Now, regardless of how it was activated, the current circumstances made for quite the interesting predicament. What I mean is that, while yes, Subaru could defeat Sirius by blowing up the entire tower, to do so would mean sacrificing Luzbel. To some, this could be seen as a necessary sacrifice, but to Subaru that was an outcome that he would never accept. Reason being that it went against everything he now currently stood for. Ever since he made up his mind to not sacrifice himself, Subaru believed he had no right to force others to either. So if saving one life meant saving many, to Subaru losing that one life was like giving up on the world. He pretty much possessed the exact opposite view of Kiritsugu. That being the case, overall this was a very tough situation. It wasn't quite enough to induce that level of despair yet though, since if he couldn't pull this off then Subaru knew he would question his value as Amelia's knight. It was a train of thought that led directly to Reinhardt. Dying twice made him forget that he was even an option, but after racking his mind hard, the obvious answer became clear, bringing us now to Subaru's third encounter in the square. It was Subaru's concern here that had actually gone to confuse me a bit, since I didn't think, or at least I wasn't aware, that there was in fact a penalty just for sharing information gained via return by death. Personally, I thought it was just about return by death itself, but Subaru was very anxious about revealing information he'd learned from return by death. It's something I swear we've seen him do numerous times before. In any case, it turns out that despite Subaru not having died in over a year, there were numerous times throughout where, when discussing return by death, the penalty for doing so would thoroughly torment him. There was this one instance where he tried to reveal it to Beatrice, only to experience hell-like pain for quite a few moments after. It didn't make him any less willing to share everything with Beatrice though, so as long as there wasn't any true consequential suffering, Subaru was still committed to sharing everything with her. This did actually help to teach Subaru something, and that was that the severity of the penalty differed, depending on the level of detail being shared about return by death. Along with who exactly it was he was telling it to, the level of suffering would change accordingly. These were the two factors in which the penalty was directly proportional to. So, sharing information with someone like Ratchins wouldn't be as severe as sharing it with someone like Amelia. It was an interesting connection Subaru constantly had to worry about, one that signified the degree of what Subaru could share depended solely on the whims of the witch. Luckily, Subaru could share quite a bit with Ratchin, so in addition to what he said in the anime, Subaru also explained who was going to attack and when it was going to happen. He had essentially given full context on everything. Sirius's entrance after was pretty much the same, except for an additional line indicating a potential mind-reading ability. I don't know if that's actually what it was, but somehow she knew that someone was thinking about her with more intensity than expected. A clear indicator that perhaps it's not just emotions that she can share. It was when Reinhardt showed up shortly after that he immediately deduced how it was Sirius's authority actually worked. Unlike how Subaru thought it was by looking her way or hearing her voice, it was instead through the mere fact of knowing that she existed. Anyone who acknowledged her in any way whatsoever was fair game to become affected by her. It was a crazy power that even Reinhardt was wary of. I'm sure this was him just being humble, but the thought of even him not being immune really worried Subaru. Sirius would then talk to Reinhardt a little bit more, basically saying how he was the ideal manifestation of everything she preached about. The way the masses came together to love him specifically really resonated with the love that Sirius liked to talk about all day. This conversation didn't really last much longer though, as Reinhardt would quickly engage in what can only be described as aerial combat. I know to us that doesn't seem very ridiculous, but to Subaru, Reinhardt's power was just becoming absurd now. The way he handled Sirius's chains was pretty crazy too, since with only his foot, he was able to gain complete control over them. It was a feat that made Subaru think Reinhardt was a literal superhero now. The rest of the fight was pretty much the same, aside from Luzbel bearing the first signs that injury was shared with Sirius too. Although Subaru didn't understand at the time, when saving Luzbel there were bruises on his arm that weren't there before. Injuries that are later hinted as ones Sirius received during her fight with Reinhardt. Sirius also didn't just accept her fate either, and instead actually tried to flee by propelling herself away with her chains. Reinhardt of course caught her instantly, then chopped her in half along with everyone else. It was the first time that Subaru had ever died so cleanly. A demise so quick that rather than pain, the only thing Subaru could feel after was surprise. This did, however, provide the information he needed to understand how he died in the first loop, so now he knew Sirius's power wasn't just a resonance of emotions, but also a transference of physical conditions too. It was enough of a problem to get Subaru to seek out more help. It was in this scene that I was hoping to find more information on Reinhardt's power, but what we saw was pretty much all we got. His dominion over mana made everyone else's non-existent. Sure, this was definitely OP, but at the same time it was also very much inconvenient. It made it so none of Subaru's allies could stand on the same field together. Individually, they were all very much formidable, but together, well, there was no plan Subaru could come up with which would let them all reach their true potential. Now, after there was this whole conversation about how Sirius's authority was similar to the high-level spell Nect, leading to the basis behind why Shamok should work against it. Since that whole theory was immediately disproved though, I can see why the anime decided to cut it. Sirius's authority was more a curse that manipulated the soul itself, not some heretical abuse of a spell that let you share senses. That's why Shamok wouldn't work against it. This brings us then to Amelia, whose astute observation highlighted Subaru's emotions right now. The reason she could tell that Subaru was about to cry was because deep down Subaru was terrified. He'd just died 3 times in an hour, which was far more death than he was used to. That's not to say that he would ever get used to dying, but to do so often was far more than what he'd handled before. His future was constantly being robbed from him in a way that was unacceptable. His soul defiled and his vow completely shattered. This is what it meant every time he died, so to have his existence trampled like that didn't really sit well with him. Fast forward to the actual fight now, and Sirius didn't come out unscathed by Amelia's attack. Half her bandages were soaked in blood, her left arm dangled as if broken, and her demeanor clearly unsteady and battered. What shocked Subaru more than that though was the way that Sirius just completely ignored him. She didn't even register that he was there, but instead focused solely on Amelia and Beatrice. The fight itself showcased Amelia's brand new style of combat, which Subaru himself dubbed as Ice Brand Arts. It was a way of fighting that took full advantage of her massive mana capacity, one that constantly reformed her weapons, allowing her to launch high-speed combo attacks. She would go in fully intending to break her weapons of ice, then immediately reshape them into something new. To Subaru, it was a beautiful display that made him feel like he was watching a fairy dance. To others, this was more a dance of ice and fire. It was in the meantime that Subaru was dealing with Sirius's soul-washed minions, tossing who he could into the waterway, then literally parkouring his way up to Luzbel. It was yet another one of the skills that Clint had taught him, and Subaru was making sure to make good use of it here. Now, there is a bit more to Amelia's fight, but that's actually something that I'm gonna save for next week since I'm not sure if they'll include it in the next episode or not. So for now, that's everything about Season 3, Episode 2, and pretty much all that I gotta say for it. If you liked the video, then leave a like, and if you want to see more, then consider subscribing. I'll be doing these every week for every episode. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!